Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Martha Carlin. She co-founded the BioCollective and the BiotiQuest. She's a microbiome researcher, originally a citizen scientist. I guess, unfortunately, her husband had Parkinson's in 2002, so she had a nice business career, but left that to help him to figure out what's going on from the perspective of the microbiome and more of a holistic approach. So today, it sounds like she's neck deep in microbiome research. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me, Richard. Excited to talk to you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, would you be okay to share the story of your husband and what happened with him?
Sure. So in 2002, my husband was 44. I was in my late 30s, and we noticed that he had a little tremor in his finger, and I actually noticed that he had lost facial expression. So I couldn't really read what his emotions when I was looking at him. And I read Michael J. Fox's book that year, Lucky Man, and noticed some of the other symptoms that might have been Parkinson's, which seemed kind of strange for a young person, but Michael J. Fox was also young. And so, started this process of several months of going to the doctor and trying to figure that out. And when we finally got to a neurologist, the neurologist recognized it just from him walking down the hallway. And for me, my background was actually in accounting and auditing, and I was trained to never take anything someone tells you at face value, to examine the evidence for yourself. And so back in 2002, that sort of launched my journey of examining the evidence for myself and trying to understand, because most of the research is really not about what causes Parkinson's or any of these neurodegenerative diseases. Most of the research is just looking for a drug that can modify the symptoms, kind of prolong the process. But there's very, very little work that actually goes into looking for what could have potentially caused it. And so that's what really launched me on this journey. And I started first by looking at the food and what was in the food supply and changing diet. And that had a tremendous impact on John. And then along the way in 2014, so that was 12 years into the diagnosis, heard about the microbiome. And I was like, what is this? And I also knew from talking to John and other people with Parkinson's that many of them had had a series of childhood infections where they had taken antibiotics frequently. And I read Martin Blazer's book, Missing Microbes, that was talking about the rise of, the rise of chronic disease and growing up in the age of antibiotics. And so that resonated. And then later that year, the first paper was published where they could divide the two types of Parkinson's by the gut bacteria. And so I quit my job and started funding some research at the University of Chicago, looking at John's microbiome and my microbiome and really trying to understand in time series what was going on there. And that led to founding the BioCollective, to not only, so we had to focus on collecting Parkinson's fecal samples, but also across the population so we could start to see, what's going on and what do these different chronic illnesses share in common in what's going on in the microbiome. And from that...
Have you considered oral microbiome? Because I've seen a number of studies. There's one guy that he sampled himself, saliva every day for a year, and his microbiome was really stable. The only 2 times where it changed dramatically is when he traveled and had very different foods and when he got sick. Otherwise, it was pretty resilient. So I wonder, fecal is a little bit tough. You do it a lot, but I wonder if you could do it as a proxy oral, if that would work.
Well, oral is very interesting. And so we did a series of oral samples with John also. And through that process, actually identified an oral pathogen called Porphyromonas gingivalis that has been correlated with Alzheimer's. So we made a really concerted effort on oral hygiene and having his teeth cleaned every 3 months professionally and doing a lot of home hygiene work to get rid of that. And actually were able to get rid of the Porphyromonas gingivalis. At least the last test that we took for him, those oral microbes were gone. And of course, we're getting colonized in our gut by the oral microbes. Those 2 things are very much connected. So that's a great idea. And there are some newer tests, like there's one called MyPeriopath, and there's one called Bristle that do the oral microbiome tests that you can, maybe people would rather do that than actually send a fecal sample, because it's not everyone's favorite thing to do, to poop and scoop, if you will.
Right, exactly. So what are some of the current goals of the BioCollective?
So the BioCollective, the first 7 years of the company, we built the biobank. We had an NIH grant to make a reference material, because most of the microbiome research that has been done, you can't compare between labs because there's no standard reference material. And so we were involved with our NIH grant in developing standard reference material. And so that is on the market now through a company called Zymo Research. And we no longer collect fecal samples. We stopped doing that in 2020 when COVID happened, just because it was really unclear. We were collecting the whole sample with live organisms. And so we felt like there were some safety issues there. And so that's when we pivoted into taking all our computational data and producing products, probiotic products, to restore the lost function in the gut. And so we took this idea that microbes work in teams, not by themselves. And so you needed to really put together a team to address the function that you needed to support. And, one of the things with my husband that we had connected some dots to years earlier, he had been a marathon runner. I've talked to quite a few people with Parkinson's. Obviously, not everyone who has Parkinson's was a marathon runner, but quite a few endurance athletes who've ended up with Parkinson's. And, there are some intense level of stress with that kind of endurance exercise, the pounding, the swinging of the electrolyte balances, and all of that alter the metabolism and also make the gut leaky. And there's quite a bit of research showing that endotoxins cross over into the bloodstream after an endurance athletic event. And, there are animal models in Parkinson's, diabetes, depression, a number of different chronic illnesses where they use endotoxin, LPS, to induce the symptoms in the animal. And so from that, really looking at his athletic history, and also he had a very kind of a lifetime history of what I'll say total toxic burden. He grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 60s and 70s when the river caught on fire. He worked on a golf course during high school and college, so he was exposed to many herbicides and pesticides.
Yeah, I heard, by the way, I've seen multiple studies now that say living near a golf course, they're exposed to all those chemicals they use to treat the course, and it's really bad. And even artificial turf, I guess, a lot of, PTFE gets volatilized turf. So people that play on it have more, problems with brain tumors and everything.
Right, yeah. So, that load from his earlier days, and then he worked in Odessa, Texas, in oil field sales. So he was out around hydrocarbons and all of that. And then ran a men's clothing store for a number of years where he was wearing dry cleaning. There's a new book out actually called The Parkinson's Plan that talks a lot about this total toxic burden. But that's also shifting the microbiome. And in the process of shifting the microbiome, all of those things are also damaging this very important barrier called the glycocalyx in the body. And, the early research on that was, people thought it was only the lining of the blood vessels. But the glycocalyx is really the lining of it's the sort of fuzzy layer over everything in the body. So that's what's lining your gut, lining the blood-brain barrier, lining the blood vessels. And it's this intelligent structure. It's a sulfated polymer that's deciding what gets in and out. And so when it's damaged, these larger particles like endotoxins or even food particles and things like that can cross over into the bloodstream and be inflammatory.
Well, have you discovered, are you looking at how these chemical exposures affect the microbiome and then subsequently cause Parkinson's, or has anyone figured out what the interaction of, dysbioses are with the microbiome and with Parkinson's?
So since Dr. Shepperhans published that first paper in 2014, there's probably another 2,000 papers on Parkinson's and the microbiome. One of the more recent ones actually also came out of Finland that was looking at organism called Vibrio. And that's actually something we're looking at. And I hope to have a publication kind of putting all the pieces together out by the end of the year with a Dr. Barry Nenham from Australia. But this Vibrio is a bacteria that produces an enzyme called urease. And that urease attacks the good bacteria in the gut and then causes a spilling out of the contents of the interior of those cells, which is largely potassium and a little bit of calcium, which contributes to about 80% of people with Parkinson's have very severe constipation, and it gets worse as the disease progresses. And so that potassium calcium makes a dense colloidal-like structure and makes it more difficult for nutrient uptake and all of that. So that's one of the organisms we've been looking at. We've also been looking at H. pylori, which is another urease producer, and there is some evidence of something called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth in people with Parkinson's, and that's where a lot of our nutritional uptake occurs. So if SIBO is essentially your small bowel being colonized by the bacteria that should be in your colon. And in the small bowel is where you're supposed to be taking up that nutrition. And so if the small bowel gets colonized by the colonic bacteria, they're stealing nutrition from you, I'll say. So there's some, evidence of depleted nutritional uptake. And then, of course, you have those endotoxin producing bacteria in there that are crossing over and causing neuroinflammation. But, so far, there's no definitive, somebody saying it's this one thing. And that, for me, I've been a systems-based thinker. And when I look at, John's life and everything he was exposed to, and, he ultimately ended up having a severe case of COVID and long COVID and had a pulmonary embolism last year. But all these things are interrelated. And so, I see Parkinson's as this complex, not just environmental, but our environment has such a huge impact on the microbiome and then the metabolism of what goes on in the body and our ability to defend against pathogens and have a healthy immune system. So all of those factors over time are kind of slowly eroding the body's ability to maintain its defense.
But is defense maintained through the microbiome integrity, or is it just one factor amongst many that you see that allows for a Parkinson's state?
My personal feeling is the microbiome and the glycocalyx together are that primary line of defense.
So what is the glycocalyx? We haven't spoke about that.
So it's a sugar-coated kind of fuzzy layer over all of the cells and the membranes in our body. So people think about the cell wall that surrounds a cell in the body or even a bacteria. That's a very thin membrane that's maybe 2 to 3 nanometers. And then this glycocalyx is about 50 nanometers. So it's this fuzzy sugar polymer. It's made of hyaluronic acid, chondroitin sulfate, and there's another sulfated piece that's in there. But it's kind of, and then off of that comes what's called the endothelial surface layer, which is like these little hair-like structures that carry a negative charge. And that's what keeps things out that should not be going into the cell and decides what can go in and out. So, I mean, I
thought ion channels were more of the regulatory mechanism to allow stuff to pass in and out of cells.
Well, so in the glycocalyx, there's something called specific ion effect. And they're not, I'll say the research of Dr. Ninham has been around. He's a physical chemist, and he's shown many of these things, from the 1980s forward. But because I'll say his publications were in more specific physics and colloidal science journals, that they hadn't been widely picked up in biology. And there is kind of a gap in understanding in biology these physical forces that actually are involved in the mechanisms of what gets in and out. So there are tubes formed in the glycocalyx, and in those tubes, that specific ion effects is what's allowing things in and out. I hope.
In parts where the glycocalyx doesn't have entry points like tubes or whatever it may be, is it supposed to be like a barrier to anything entering? Is there any porosity of like glycocalyx otherwise?
So it is, well, it's not a fixed. So I'll say it's a shapeshifter, if you will. So, we think about membranes as being, one layer or a lipid bilayer, that's two layers. The glycocalyx is something that's called bicontinuous. And by that, it means it can change its shape from a laminar structure to what's called a cubic phase. And that's where it would have more of the channels through it, where things could move through it. So, and certain parts of it can be one shape while another part is another shape. So we like to think in terms of, what we've looked at in textbooks, that everything is kind of fixed. But everything is not fixed. It's constantly reacting to, let's say, for example, those chemicals we're coming in contact with that change and alter the size of the openings that allow things in and out through the glycocalyx. Does that make sense?
I got you. Yeah. Like selective, it's kind of like a puzzle piece where an enzyme might dock with a receptor.
Yeah. Or, like I in my mind, I sort of picture it a little bit like a sponge that is, a sponge when it's getting wet, it's expanding. And as it's drying out, it's tightening up. I mean, that's not a perfect example of it, but it is one way to kind of visualize it in your mind.
I got you. Well, let's go back to the microbiome for a little bit. You said, I think it was Porphyromonas gingivalis is associated with Parkinson's. Was that the right name?
Porphyromonas gingivalis has been associated with Alzheimer's. It produces something called a gingipane, and it also produces a black pigment. And what they have found in some people with Alzheimer's in the brains on autopsy after they've passed away is they have found this Porphyromonas gingivalis in the brain. And I think also the gingipanes.
Okay, so some of the metabolites it produces are toxic. Does it produce like the tau tangles or beta plaque in Alzheimer's, or like what does it produce specifically that appears to be correlated with Alzheimer's and or Parkinson's?
I'd have to go back and look at that because it's been a while since I've looked at it. I do talk to people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's a lot about the importance of good oral hygiene. A lot of times they're less interested in the technical specifics than they are how do I protect myself. And it's interesting as people get older, good oral hygiene becomes more difficult, especially in Parkinson's where the fine motor skills are not as good as they used to be. And so brushing your teeth becomes one of those more difficult daily tasks.
Oh, really? I didn't think about that. Like, I know, cutting your toenails gets harder and bending over and all that stuff. What happens to people? They can't articulate the brush to get in the crevices, so they have kind of a half-done, half-assed toothbrushing?
Exactly. Or, it's just cumbersome enough that sometimes they just don't do it.
Well, what happened? It's frustrating it just takes a long time to do, or what happened?
Yeah, it becomes frustrating. Or there's another woman, her name is Emily Stein, who she has invented an oral, I think it dissolves in the mouth, that she came up with for her grandmother who was in a nursing home. And of course, in a nursing home, a lot of times they're waiting for somebody to help them brush their teeth. And I want to say hers has maybe has an enzyme or something that may be beneficial. But, you just think about the daily activity of keeping your teeth clean and the importance of that. And there's a dentist that I've become friends with named Dr. Debbie Osment, and she basically puts out videos of how to do good oral care throughout the day. So not just waiting till you brush your teeth at the end of the night. And of course, a number of the toothpastes actually, have chemicals in them that can be disruptive to our glycocalyx. And that's, once again, that's a protective barrier. So you have to be mindful of also what you're using for your dental care.
Interesting. Right. What are other entry points? So the mouth is a big one. Anything else that's been discovered that worsens Parkinson's? And are there studies where people that take care of their mouth, like they brush twice a day, does that reduce the symptoms of Parkinson's once they have a problem, or like what happens?
That is a great question. I don't know if anybody has ever studied that, but I'm going to take a slight right turn here because you ask, is there any other thing that may be a factor in Parkinson's? So I have been working on a docu-series interviewing people with Parkinson's, telling us their life stories. I'm working on that with the Resolve Parkinson's Foundation. And in the process of doing that, we've interviewed about 35 people now, maybe a little more than that. And we notice this pattern of traumatic events or some type of stressor or just continuous low-grade chronic stress preceding the diagnosis of Parkinson's. And as an example, I had two different parts of the country who both had a son who was hit by a drunk driver and had a very long traumatic recovery. And both of those fathers were diagnosed with Parkinson's about 6 years after their son's accident. And, when you talk to them, you can see that they're still holding, that shock, grief, and trauma in their bodies. And over time of interviewing a number of people, it's either, there was some death, some major financial loss, a job loss, all kinds of emotional triggers. And, we found that to be really, really telling because it's also something that a neurologist...
It's like a persistent stressor, I guess, in the body.
Yeah, it's a persistent stressor in the body. And stress changes the microbiome. So the work of John Cryan, Ted Dinan, and Mark Light in a field called microbial endocrinology, it's basically shown that many of these hormones and neurotransmitters are made in our gut and then signaled to our brain. And so we get in these loops. So if you're in this state of chronic stress, you're sort of switched over to, adrenaline and cortisol and all of those stress hormones that run the body down, alter the microbiome, and can contribute in ways that I think are still underappreciated in Parkinson's.
Yeah, makes sense. So, going back to the oral microbiome just for a minute, have you found any dentists or dentistry protocols where they say, you have diabetes, Parkinson's, or Alzheimer's, we have a special treatment plan for you, come in every quarter instead of every 6 months or every month? We do more periodontal cleanings, this, that, and the other. Have you seen any of that out there?
I haven't seen any of that out there actively marketing that way. What we did, though, was, we sought out a good periodontist and had a very good deep cleaning. And there's another retired physician with Parkinson's who has actually been talking a lot to people about root canals. And, my husband, John, had several root canals. And, we did notice he had a couple of those removed and he felt much better after getting the root canals out. But, that's also a process that you have to be very careful with because if you don't have, let's say, a good quality biological dentist who knows how to take those out without releasing mercury into the body and some of the toxins from the root canal, that can also cause downstream effects. But I think that's another area that's underappreciated, the connection with Parkinson's and teeth, because there is a publication I found a few years back that actually showed people with Parkinson's on average had lost 4 more teeth than people who didn't have Parkinson's.
Were they molars, front teeth, or just, were the condition of the mouth in general?
I don't remember the specifics of the paper. I would guess it's probably more molars and teeth in the back. But, I think to me, it makes sense because if you just go back to the fine motor skills that are involved in brushing your teeth and dental care, that's probably an area that suffers early on without even thinking about it.
Okay, I understand. So what is some of the research that BioCollective is doing, or, what are you guys doing to help contribute to the understanding of Parkinson's? What kind of experimentation do you have going?
We haven't been doing, what we've done is we've taken our data and shared it with academics kind of across the world. We have a publication with Sarkis Masmanian, who's been looking at a lot of things related to the immune system. We've done collaboration with a company called Axial that is bringing a microbiome. I think they're going into a phase 2 clinical trial in Parkinson's. But most of what I have done in the last 2 or 3 years, I have a small nonprofit called BioCollective Research, and I've been pulling together interdisciplinary science, people who are outside the typical realm of looking at Parkinson's and working with them, looking at different aspects of how the microbiome might impact, let's say, for example, the glycocalyx, how those are interrelated. And so in May of this year, we hosted a meeting at Stouts Island Lodge in Wisconsin. It was about 40 scientists. So, we had from a clinical neurologist down to actual Parkinson's patients who came, and Dr. Ninham, who's the chemical or the colloid scientist from Australia, was there. Hans Vink, who is a pioneer in the glycocalyx, was there. Malu Tanzi, she's a immunologist and Parkinson's researcher now at Indiana University. Anyway, we had a very broad group of people with Parkinson's and just general science background kind of come together for 3 days to talk about, what are we missing in Parkinson's? How has our reductionist thinking affected our ability to really think about and understand what are the causal factors, and then how might we look at addressing or, providing some relief for some of the non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's. And so coming out of that, we're actually working on putting together a small study that would look at simple approaches to addressing constipation to reduce the toxic load that's stuck in the bowels. A probiotic that a number of people with Parkinson's, I made it for my husband originally. It's our Sugar Shift product that addresses constipation, but also helps address toxic load. And we know from a clinical trial that we did, reduces serum endotoxin. So we know it's reducing those gram-negative bacteria in the microbiome. And then looking at a solution called Revasca to help restore the glycocalyx. And then kind of a fourth step of that is testing for total toxic burden. So I have a friend I've known for about 10 years who actually comes from a background in dentistry, but has done a lot of microbiome work and has a new company called DetoxU that will be coming out probably the first of the year with a test that can test over 300 different toxic chemicals in the body. So then you have a better assessment of what are you looking at, because we know it's not one thing. We know it's more like a syndrome or a number of different factors. So, we're looking at a little study to try to put those pieces together and see if we can get relief from some of those non-motor symptoms. And then there was a group that met at our conference and came together and has put in an application for I think there's a new program called Cure One, Cure All. And it sounds like their odds are pretty good of, potentially getting a sizable grant to try out an approach they have using I want to say might be DHEA type molecule. I haven't read the grant, but I did get something that sounds like that's moving forward. So most of our work is around fostering collaboration and really getting people to work together and get outside of their silos. Because I think the reason why, we're not finding answers to things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's is because they're not simple. They are complex. And we've been looking for a single magic bullet. And what we have to understand is it's our complicated lifestyle that's contributing to the increase in these diseases. And so to address that, we've got to address the terrain, the chemicals that we're exposed to, cleaning up our environment, cleaning up the food we're eating, focusing on our microbiome health, restoring the good bacteria in the gut, focus on our oral health. There's a lot of kind of pieces to that puzzle. And there are things that can be done now that don't need some 10 or 15-year drug trial.
Really better care of your teeth, that kind of stuff. Yep.
Right. It's, focus on what you're putting in and on your body.
Well, like with your husband, you said you had a deep periodontal cleaning. Any difference that you noticed, or was he advanced at that point? It didn't seem to help. Like, what happened with it?
It actually did seem to help. It was interesting. He did the deep periodontal cleaning. It was after he had COVID. So the long COVID was really the kind of, he was doing fabulous up to that point. But we did see improvement after doing the periodontal cleaning. And I would say...
What did improvement look like?
Just like less fatigue, more, just kind of more on it with his energy and his ability to get out and do things.
Okay, gotcha.
And it's interesting because in talking to, I actually had the periodontist on I do bi-weekly calls with my educational series for my customers. And I had the periodontist on just this past week talking about oral care, but also, for her dealing with, patients with advanced cancer. So she told us about a patient that came to her that they were having trouble. They were treating him for, I want to say might have been liver tumor. I can't remember what kind of tumors it was, but the chemotherapy was not working. They were having all kinds of problems. And she did an oral microbiome test and found Fusobacterium nucleatum. And they actually addressed that with, they did a deep cleaning. And I think he may have had to take a metronidazole to address that, but got all of that cleared up, got him on an oral hygiene program. And within about a month and a half, the tumors were starting to disappear. So I think there's a lot more connected to the oral microbiome than people have any idea of how all of that is connected. In fact, you would probably just love to talk to Dr. Debbie Osment, and I'd be happy to send you a connection.
That'd be great offline, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
Well, very good. Well, we're right about out of time. So thank you for coming. And how can people follow up and look at the BioCollective and see what it's doing? What's the best way?
So there's a couple ways. So if you want to know the history of the sample collection and all of that, our BioCollective website tells that history, and that's, thebiocollective.com. Most of my work today is on the probiotic side, which is BiotiQuest.com. That's BiotiQuest.com. I write a lot of blog content about the microbiome and different health factors around that, and also about fermented foods. We also have a YouTube channel, BiotiQuest, that has a lot of our educational, the educational series Sugar Ship Challenge that we do for our customers. And then I have a Substack called Martha's Quest, and I write about Parkinson's and other things in the microbiome there. And then I have actually a blog called Martha's Quest.
Okay. Well, very good, Martha. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, explaining all this. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.